So quiet. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Fremantle Arts Centre. My name is Glenn Iseger-Pilkington. I'm the curator of the Visual Arts program here, and we're very grateful that you've joined us here this evening. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge that we meet on Wajak Noongar Budja here at Walyallup. We're really invested in making sure that First Nations stories, First Nations art and culture are really celebrated in a meaningful way. Just want to acknowledge, ancestors of the places and the custodians that look after this country now and the generations that will come. Disclosure is an evening of ideas and discourse and dialogue. It shapeshifts every time we do this. And for Marawar-ak from the West, contemporary art from Western Australia, it was a really timely opportunity to bring together a panel to discuss art in Western Australia today. Art Today in WA. Very catchy title. And in doing that, we've thought about the kinds of people that are working in this space. A panel like this can never be truly reflective of the whole industry. There are only 5 seats here tonight, and a lot more here in the crowd. But we've brought together a group of people who are working in different producing roles, curatorial roles, commercial spaces, who work across all different kinds of multidisciplinary practice. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we have Annika Kristensen here this evening as our moderator. Thank you, Annika. We have Mayma Awaida, who will join us tonight, and Mayma's a curator working in Perth. Katherine Wilkinson from the Fremantle Biennale, and Andrew Varano from Sweet Pea Arts, and a number of other exciting projects. And I am Glenn. I am a Nunda and Noongar person as well, so for me it's really important to be here and to be having these kinds of discussions. So I'm going to throw over to Annika, who is doing the hard graft tonight of bringing this conversation together, and then we'll throw over to each of our panellists to talk a little bit more about their experience in the arts. So thank you.
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you for that very warm welcome, and thanks to you all for coming tonight. I know it's an incredibly busy time of year and not easy to get away, so I really appreciate seeing a full room of people. I too would like to acknowledge the Wajak Noongar people as traditional custodians of Walyallup, where we meet together tonight. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge the profound, long-standing and ongoing contribution that First Nations people make to art, knowledge, culture and our understandings of place. In our conversation this evening, we'll inevitably be talking about ideas of geographic and cultural isolation, a sense of being remote and on the edge. But for Noongar people, this place is and has always been the centre. And so I think that's an idea perhaps that we can just reflect upon as we embark upon this evening's conversation. So when Glenn asked if I could moderate tonight's disclosure talk, I jumped at the chance, because art today in WA is a topic that's of enormous personal interest to me, in part because as someone who's been very privileged to live and work in many great cities, I really love getting under the skin of a place and sort of understanding what makes it tick. But also more personally, I've returned to Perth recently after 15 years of establishing a career for myself interstate and overseas, and so it is a question that I sort of have been asking myself and many colleagues along the way about what the characteristics are that might define the contemporary art scene in Perth, in WA. I've returned to a city that is stubbornly familiar in many ways, but equally one that has sort of matured and changed in the time since I have lived here. So I trust that there's magic going on in backyards and in garages that I'm now too old to be cool enough to know about, just as inevitably there's a rich history of experimentation in Perth that I'm also too young to have experienced firsthand. So I'm often asking artists who live and work here what they perceive as the benefits, but also the incredible and inevitable challenges of basing a practice in Perth, and asking them if they feel like they're part of a larger community, of practitioners and peers. And the answers that I come across are always different, of course, but there are some common experiences and sentiments. And so just anecdotally, I would say that there's a sense of freedom here, of space, and when I say that I mean both physical and critical space, to take creative risks. There's, I think, a sense of compulsion and of urgency, the need to create in order to fill what could perhaps unkindly be called a kind of creative void. And an outward-looking mentality. There's an awareness of the fine line between pride and parochialism, and a sense of being informed by the context and location that they're working within, but not limited to it. Less positive issues are also commonly raised, so those might be limited funding opportunities in a state that's so buoyed by an extraction economy, the challenge having their work reach broad audiences outside of regular gallery goers in Perth, and certainly that's something I've witnessed, on a nice day on my way to a gallery in the city. I notice everyone at the beach and no one in the galleries, so what can we do to kind of change that mentality? They speak of limited exhibition opportunities for mid-career and senior artists at a certain point in their practice, a short historical memory and limited intergenerational exchange, and an urban sprawl that characterises this city that can cause difficulties, I think, for the organic creation of artistic centres and communities. So tonight I'm joined by 4 incredible curatorial colleagues and peers that each work across different contexts, including community and site-responsive art projects, commercial and not-for-profit gallery spaces. And each of them have first-hand experience of working directly with artists to commission and create new work for broad and diverse public audiences. And so I'm excited to also learn from them as much as the artists that I've had the pleasure of meeting with in the last year to, reflect on what they observe as perhaps current tendencies in art practice here and reflect more broadly on some of the opportunities and also obstacles that the WA arts sector presents more broadly. So the format for tonight's discussion will be a brief presentation from each of the panellists where they're going to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about the pathways that have led to their current, career positions and discuss a recent project that each of them have worked upon. Then we'll collectively discuss some talking points before opening up to the audience for questions. So please dream up some burning questions for either individuals or more collectively for us to discuss as a panel. So Mayma, we'll begin with you. If you'd be so kind to talk about your current role more recently as the curator of Space Know Thy Neighbour, number 3 program, and a little bit about your career pathway to date and a recent project that you've been working on.
It's on. Excellent. Firstly, thank you so much, everyone that's come tonight. Thank you for inviting me, Glenn, and for everyone that's been so generous to contribute their time to come tonight. Echoing both Glenn and Annika's statements, I absolutely do not take lightly the opportunity to work, find creative energy and collaboration on this beautiful Wajak Noongar country, especially as a migrant that has come to these lands seeking safety and home. So that is something that I just wanted to share tonight. In terms of, my background, tonight I'm speaking from my position as the curator of Know Thy Neighbour 3, which is a program that has been commissioned by an organisation called Spaced. I do oscillate between a number of different roles as happens in the arts on occasion, but that's kind of the main background that I'm speaking from tonight. In terms of, where I started from and how I've arrived at the point that I'm at now, I've had quite a diverse background in terms of my study and my interests. As I said, I'm a migrant that came to Australia probably a decade and a half ago. So I've spent most of my life overseas, the other half here. And I feel like in a way kind of stumbled upon my work as a happy accident. So I studied a range of things at university, from cultural studies to French to psychology, you name it. And I think what kind of unites all those kind of disparate threads in my practice is working with people and exploring language, exploring a sense of shared space and reciprocity and that kind of exchange. So my background, essentially is in community arts. I've worked with Katherine over here through Data before. I've worked with Andrew over here through Cool Change, and at the moment working with an organisation, as I said, called Spaced, on a program called Know Thy Neighbour 3, which the curatorial focus kind of looks at how do people engage with their space, both in the sense of the cultural memory that's attached to space, and you only need to look back a couple of hundred years to know that a place has always existed wherever you go. It's not a new concept. So the program, I guess, looks to, through the form of a residency, reveal the existing and hidden narratives of space, and also look at the relationship between those relationships and memories and attachments, as well as the built form. How do environments change over time? How does colonisation impact these spaces, and where do those relationships kind of sit now? So thought I'd just flick through a couple of slides to show you, I guess, what the current Know Thy Neighbour 3 program has been looking at, and hopefully give a little bit of further context to what I've been curating over the last year. Oh no. Hello. So the Know Thy Neighbour 3 program actually comprises of 6 artists that we've partnered with 6 various community partner hosts. So we have had the city of Subiaco, the city of East Fremantle, the city of Canning, Armidale, East Vic Park, and Armidale. So I thought I would kind of go through a few of them rather than all of them, because otherwise I could take up this entire slot. One program, I guess, and this is reflective of sort of the chronological order that they have taken place in. We had Elham, Estrag and Hutchinson begin the residency program in the town of East Vic Park. And also, as someone coming from a migrant background, Elham was really fascinated with this sense of diaspora, this sense of looking at home as a tiered concept, I suppose. And in working with the town of Vic Park, which has seen massive developments, especially along Albany Highway, which is now like a massive retail and hospitality hotspot, how has the infrastructure changed in those areas to sort of move people outside of the normative demographic into other corners of the suburb. So kind of combining those interests and that personal baggage, she looked at what she refers to as different tiers of homelessness. So what does it mean to have a home? What does it mean to feel separate to a home? What does that also look like, as I said, in a built environment? So her work actually involved working with the residents of Vic Park, working specifically with people at the St Mary's Outreach Service, which deals specifically with people experiencing houselessness. So in terms of, I guess, where I oversee some of that work, there's a lot of different ways to engage with people, and also to be critiquing how you maintain these dialogues with people that aren't necessarily working in an art space and also need to have their safety protected. So Elham actually responded with a filmic poem that I guess is loosely documented in these images, but I can speak to further if you would like to ask questions at a later point. All the way over to something completely different, which was in the city of Melville. We actually had Amy Perejwan-Capone look at how people move around space with dogs, whether they be people's pets or whether you're going to a dog park. And I guess just how having a pet can actually open up particular social interactions, make you meander through particular areas of your neighbourhood, and engage in social conversations that you might not necessarily be in. So my work, I suppose, involves working with a range of different people on a range of different levels with a range of different skill sets. And I think hopefully this project kind of helps to encompass that there's no one way to go about working in a community. And I think this was maybe the last one that I had to wrap up this, I guess, segment, which was Yabani Kikit was also part of this program, working in the town of East Fremantle. We actually had an activation event a couple of nights ago at what is known as John Tonkin Reserve in East Fremantle. Her work started off with exploring school environments, how people in East Fremantle go to school, walk home from school, engage with, I guess, like their very direct community there, and actually evolved into something that was much broader and looked at a site which was very prominent in East Fremantle for a very long time, which was the Woodside Maternity Hospital, which delineated into this exploration of birth and raising children in the suburb. So hopefully, to a degree, that's kind of captured the many channels, I guess, that my work involves, and the way, I guess, that curating in the space that I'm in at the moment involves being responsive to a range of different people and a range of different needs and different, I guess, value as well around the arts. The last one, actually, sorry, I said the last one before, but the last one, and I know it's definitely not going to be long because I've got just one picture, was we had actually Olga Saronis and Duncan Wright in the city of Armidale who spearheaded that work or that residency with a range of kind of subtle installations that involves, residents in the Harrisdale and Piara waters, which is a very built-up residential suburb, a new suburb in Armidale, offering small stories and pieces through a typewriter that would kind of move around in different places and appear, which then evolved into portrait shots of people. And at the moment, Olga and Duncan have been generating these T-shirts, which actually emerged from an offering that was made through the typewriter. I think hopefully that's kind of helped to give a bit of context. I know it's a bit winding, but we can go back to that at another point maybe.
Winding is good. Okay. Thanks. Duncan Wright, who was just on the previous slide. Yeah. Hi everyone. Big thanks for coming. As Mayma said, really good to be here tonight with you all, particularly here in Wajak country, and as always sending out big respect and thanks to the ancestors, to the elders, to emerging leaders whose sort of care and custodianship allows us to be here to have these chats and winding conversations, as always. I guess my background, I'll tell this kind of linear sounding story, but actually it's really circled around for many years now. But I similarly was at uni floating around in many subject forms and decided to sort of throw myself into doing an honours year after some time off. And I had this really big idea of going in and writing a thesis on graffiti art, because at the time that's what I was doing, and there was a lot of money because at the time the WA police were giving like a lot of cash to like these anti-crime art projects, so we were just sort of doing murals all around and it was really fun, and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. And my honours supervisor was like, it's not really a thing, yet. I just don't think you should do this. And so he uncovered this book. He's like, okay, you want to do something in public space? And he sort of threw this book to me, which was a new genre of public arts, this idea of site-specific art. And it was kind of, this is sort of 10, 12 years ago, and it was kind of a conversation which had just been starting, particularly in the US and America. And I was like, this is really cool, and I kind of really grabbed hold of that and sort of ran from there, and just so happened to land a gig a few years later with Spaced, who Mayma mentioned before, and spent a lot of time. At that time they were doing a lot of work in regional remote WA communities, and at kind of around the same time I also started working with Data, who is WA's Arts and Disability, Arts and Health organisation. And at the same time, roughly, I was also working events and hospitality. So after many years, I've kind of managed to narrow down a lot of my thinking and dabbling in many areas to a sort of producer practice which looks at this idea of place-responsive art and what that is, to a practice which thinks about working with artists and audiences to think about access, and to think specifically about access as a creative practice that can be embedded in many layers of making and also audiences, or how we sort of host audiences. And then by extension, I'm very interested in sort of frameworks of thinking about generosity, hospitality, and invitation in how we sort of make art, so both for artists but also how we consider audiences and bringing them into a work. And I sort of for many years worked a lot in public space but also in exhibition contexts, and in the last sort of 5 to 6 years have really moved into the festival space, and that for me is a really interesting space to think about site-specific, place-responsive, and making, and sort of really being able to access audiences at many layers and also at scale. And so my current role is as Program Director with Fremantle Biennale. And I'm just a quick show of hands, otherwise I won't go into it. Is everyone familiar with the Fremantle Biennale? Perhaps you saw the drone show? Yeah, great, okay. Great, I won't. So it's the ticket at the moment, right? So we're a festival that takes place every 2 years, and I guess it's a really evolving space. It's a relatively new organisation which began in 2017, and we are looking at sort of long-form collaborative processes and making with place and unpacking exactly what that means. And so a way for me to talk about that is to talk about some examples. These are all from the 2021 festival. I couldn't quite decide what would be relevant to talk about. But so Bruno Booth's Tightness Times Toughness. This work was obviously a commission specifically for this place. Our last festival, we were really focused between the two Fremantle bridges. And it's a space that's like, I guess it didn't really feel good for people. You walk around there and it's really sparse and no one's really hanging out there. People drive down there, and it's sort of just not a space where people feel particularly comfortable. So we commissioned artist Bruno Booth to produce this work, which involved navigating the two corridors in a wheelchair. And as audience members were invited to go down, the corridors became much narrower and much lower as they came through. And the work was really an invitation from the artist Bruno for audiences to experience the world as he does in public space as a wheelchair user, and to really, I guess, be invited a festival to go through the experience, but also to experience moments of sort of tension and tightness as they sort of attempted to navigate this corridor. And it was really a moment for them to think about, I guess, other people's experiences of navigating public space in a really sort of textural and visceral way. I'm just going to skip through. How much time do we have? There's too much to go into.
Ample. Keep going. It's all good.
I'm just going to say random thoughts that pop into my head. A nice thing about this project was working with a building contractor who, there's really interesting ways for us to think about sustainability in making large-scale public artworks, particularly here. And we actually work quite closely with the building contractor who helps supports artists to design the projects so that all building materials can be used on future mega build projects elsewhere. This was a good one to think about, place-responsive practice, which we're still thinking on now, so, and also particularly to think on what it means to support WA artists. So we've worked with artist Jessie Lee Johns to host the Commonwealth of New Bayswater for each festival. And we have worked with Jessie since its inception, which kind of goes against the festival model a little bit sometimes, of this idea that you always have to working with like different artists and new things each time. And we've really asked what it means to support an artist making here over a really extended period of time. So we're still working with Jessie, and he will once again produce for us in 2023. This work, his Tiny Nation, it's a collection of everything you might have in a small micronation. So it includes usually a hotel or a motel, a contemporary institute of modern art, a music program, a post office, an immigration department, a tiny Michelin star restaurant, and they usually occupy spaces that such tiny nations could not. So this was situated on the heavy lift jetty down at East Street. And the paperwork to get this across the line was the equivalent of actually opening a hotel. Like, I'm not joking. And so there's something in the process of making these works with these artists and going through that is the work. So this idea that we had to go through these complete processes to be able to open a tiny nation meant that that's what it was. There you go, some more. And I mean, as you sort of all have nodded to, Alona Maguire's Mumbakai, our choreographed drone light show at the last festival, many of you might have seen. And this work came about because we were sort of exploring a number of works during the sort of COVID time, and there was lots of sort of barriers and many reasons for why a lot of the works we were thinking about, either the artists weren't here or it was just not possible for us to engage with the river and its sort of built environments in ways where we could produce art projects within them. And so we were sort of left with this conundrum of the only space we could look to was the sky. And at the time we were really recentering how we thought about making and commissioning work, and this idea, just flipping that idea of this progression that's expected of artists, that they should do a certain number of works in certain institutions and get the track record before they get like a big commission. And we sort of wanted to flip that idea and really think about developing the capacity of WA artists, and specifically for this project, we were looking at sort of early career artists. And so at the time, this sort of drone technology floated on our radars, and we were talking with our Wajark cultural advisors about what do you think, is this something that could happen? A very long story short. This work was created, and at the time Ilona was still at university, and there was this sort of conversation of actually how you can support artists who, she had no background working in technology at that time, and came from more of a visual and printmaking practice, but what you can do as a producer to support artists to tell stories in mediums and with community in ways they might not normally have access to. And that's something the festival really thinks about, is that how can we support artists and give them access to sites, history, circumstances, contexts and places they would not otherwise have access to, and giving that over in a way that they can really push their practice. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Katherine.
Hi everyone, my name's Andrew. I'd also like to acknowledge we're on Wajark Noongar country, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I run a commercial gallery called Sweet Pea. We've been operating for about a year. Before that, I was working at Pika in the exhibitions team. And I was working at Pika on and off for quite some time. I was there, actually started there when I was in art school, 2006, in the gallery. And gallery attending and working in the bar and all that sort of stuff. And then I was in and out of there for a while, and actually developed a specialisation in arts installation. So I worked at the Art Gallery of WA, I worked here at FAC and Lawrence Wilson and all those kind of places. Took on the curator role at Pika for a while, and then went into the exhibitions team. So that's sort of like my super brief working history. I've also worked a lot with artist-run initiatives. So I worked with Cool Change, with Mayma, which at the time was an ARI which did about 30 exhibitions a year, 33. And I've also ran a gallery called OK Gallery in 2010, which was a commercial gallery, but it's weird to call it a commercial gallery because it wasn't commercially viable. So it feels so it was a gallery, I think. And I've also worked in another ARI called Pet Projects, which was a garage space in Bayswater that I ran with a couple of friends, Dan Burke and Gemma Weston. And we still occasionally exhibit under the group Pet Projects, like very occasionally. Very rarely is probably more accurate to say. So I came into Sweet Pea after leaving Pika because I was working there for a while and I was just looking for the next thing to do, and I felt like at the time there was a bit of an opportunity for a commercial gallery in Perth. There hasn't really been many commercial galleries that have opened up in the last 10 years. There was a huge closure of commercial gallery spaces in WA about 10, 15 years ago, which left a lot of West Australian artists unrepresented. And I felt there was a big need to be more of a support act, like a concentrated and ongoing support act for individual artists who I think both needed the support and showed a lot of promise in their practice. What? Put the clicker. Oh, right here. Sorry. So this is where the gallery is. I took this photo after I signed the lease about a year ago. So it's a commercial, it was a retail space on Pierce Street. So retail spaces aren't doing too well in Perth, so I took advantage of the retail apocalypse in Perth and took out a lease on this commercial space because you can get spaces quite cheap at the moment. So I fixed in a lease here. And my first show was with Jack Ball, who at the time was doing a solo when we opened, Jack was doing a solo at Agua at the same time as doing a solo at Sweet Pea. So the show at Agua was more about the non-binary experience, non-binary and gender-wise, I mean experience of like eroticism and libido and sensibilities. This show we did at Sweet Pea had more to do with a logic coming out of having dyslexia, and so it's more about like a patchwork of thinking, associations, those sort of things. It's about non-linear thinking in a way, which we didn't stress too much in the catalogue essay. It's more, I always believe it's better to show rather than to tell. So it was just sort of about showing how that kind of logic could operate. And I also work with the artists to sort of manage their careers. So I do a show every 2 months at the gallery, but it's not just about churning out shows. The vast majority of the work actually happens behind the scenes. So I actually do career management with the artists I represent as well. So we, depending on the level of support that they want, we look at their goals and how to reach them. And, sometimes that means actually like sitting down and doing their household budgets with them or like doing cash flows and stuff like that. Other times it's writing grants and those sort of things. So this is just some stockroom photography. Like long story short, one of the goals with Jack was Jack wanted to work full-time as an artist, so they left their job doing trans mental health research at Princess Margaret, the Telethon Institute. So they left their job to work full-time as an artist at the same time that we launched the solo show. So part of my job was to kind of look at how we could actually practically make them working as a full-time artist possible. So one thing we did is we applied for a grant where Jack would get paid to do all the documentation photography for the last year, and so these are just some really cute stockroom shots of the office and the stockroom. And we've been open for a year, and that's about me. I'll leave it there.
So I'm a bit nervous, and I think it's because I'm so close to this edge. Yeah, so I'm not going to move my chair. Okie dokie. So I'm Glenn, and I guess I was just thinking, like, looking around this room, thank you all for being here. Like, it just feels sometimes like being in a room full of friends and family, which is amazing. But just the kind of community that we have and how we all work with each other, and there's people in the room who have written for us, who have worked on Install, who, you know, Annika and I worked together on programs for the festival, and Katherine and I worked together years ago in Revealed, and Andrew helped me install a show in the middle of the pandemic, and I'm just always overwhelmed by the community that we have and the support that we've all provided to each other and continue to provide to each other in times when we wish we could probably get to more of each other's activities as well. So just wanted to reflect on that. My career experience. Okay, so my art career started at number 8 Phillimore Street in Fremantle, and some 17 years ago, later I find myself in Fremantle again. So I studied printmaking at Edith Cowan University, which was at that time a part of, what's the name of the, AWAPA? So we were art students in WAPA, which was cool. I did education for a year before that and did a prac and ran screaming out of the university that I never wanted to see children again. So that's kind of how I got to visual arts. And I was terrible at sport, and I grew up in the Kimberley, and so there weren't a lot of other options. It was either you're an art kid or a sport kid. And also in a family of football players and people who were quite able-bodied on the field, and so my mother kind of always encouraged arts. And so I studied, and I took 8 years to do a visual arts degree, which seems like a long time to complete that, but at the same time worked at Artsource and managed their regional Indigenous development program, which was, you know, at its core about supporting artists to develop their practice. And I really liked the kind of opening sentiment, Annika, of this being the centre, you know, and not the edge. And I think I've lived my whole life in Western Australia, and I don't intend on ever leaving, and I think that's because in so many ways it is the centre for me. And being a part of a migrant family as well, that is weird, but it just feels like everything made here by First Nations practitioners is site-specific art, right? It's about country and everything that's around us. My grandfather was a painter and a carver, and so he was an obnoxious old man, but he'd let me watch him make stuff, and I think having a migrant family and all these little objects that were portals to Europe as well, I've been obsessed with objects and what they can do and tell. And so from Artsource, I then peaked out really earlier in my career and worked at the Art Gallery of WA for 7 years. And that's where I did my curatorship under the stewardship of amazing people like Gary DeFore and Alan Dodge, and I worked with Robert Cook and Lucy Harper, who now has worked with the city and has followed me to a number of organisations. It was a really great place to learn about all the complexities of the art world. And I never want to work in a large state organisation again. And that's cool. I'm sort of running out of places to work in WA. So I've worked at the South Australian Museum as their first curator of Aboriginal art and culture. That's a long story. As perhaps their second. There were a couple of other curators, and that's quite a contentious thing for me to say, so we might remove that from the video recording. And then I worked at the New Museum Project for a couple of years on a redevelopment for the Boulevard, and then I ran a business, and then COVID hit, and I lost all of my work. So a year of planning and a year of work disappeared in about 4 days, and I remember that being quite a distressing experience. And then I started applying for real jobs again, and after a year of interview processes, found myself here. Long story short, I kind of have started my career specialising in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, and have in the last 18 months found myself working with artists from all walks of life. But I will reiterate that developing a specialty in First Nations art is actually far more complicated, I would think, in so many ways, in terms of the terrain that you navigate, that prepares you to be able to do all the other work. And so I spent, I guess, like a kind of personal reflection or a professional reflection. When I started here, I was really nervous about the things I had to prove to the art world. And 18 months later, I am super confident about everything that I'm doing. And that's a real journey to take in 18 months. So, yeah, and I sit here in this exhibition kind of really proud of the artists that I work with and thankful and grateful for that time and for their work, but also really proud of everything we've done in the last 18 months. We've renamed our galleries with Noongar names. We are foregrounding First Nations people in all of the work that we do, and we are inviting artists who have existed on the periphery and the margins to have space here and to kind of really tell their stories. And I think that's a thing that all of us would speak to at FAC, is that we support people to tell their own stories. And so that's, again, like a really central part of the work that I do. And yeah, and we also work with artists on great commissioning projects. That's me, great photo, Beck Mansell, thank you. And this was one of the exciting ones that I thought spoke to kind of the complexities of politics of voice, and the artist is here with us, Sam Bloor, welcome. And this was perhaps my first major curatorial moment here at Fremantle Arts Centre, a part of our festival show, thank you, the Perth Festival, for your ongoing support, and was a part of Undertow. So really thinking about kind of the theme of the festival, which was exciting because it gave me something to latch onto, and thinking about Warradan or oceans as a point of departure, a point of arrival, and a point of contention. And I was really lucky to have met Sam at my barbershop very briefly, and then kind of ran into each other a few times and had a few chats about projects. And this work, the name of the actual work, is it That Sinking Feeling, was a two-part work, one that sort of happened in our Coolbardie Hall here, but also existed on site down at Esplanade Park in Fremantle, that really kind of worked into the things Sam was interested in, the power of words, of text, of the tropes of nationalism that you see written in literature, in newspaper articles, that you hear in interviews, and I guess the complexities of being a settler artist and navigating a terrain of care for other humans, but hearing this kind of rhetoric reiterated at regular intervals in what we call progressive Australia. So these are the works that sat in gallery. I really loved this moment of there being two mirrors, one that said Lucky Country, the other that said Illegal Bodies. Sam and I spent lots of time. Well, Sam serenaded me on a trip on the Ferris wheel, which you will soon see, to talk about this project and what it could be. So good move. But essentially thinking about the ocean as a place of contestation, as a place of violence and turmoil for people seeking asylum who are escaping homelands to come to places of opportunity, and the rhetoric that comes from, shall I say, the right side of our political schema here in Australia. And Sam talked to me about this idea as we're going up on this ride, about the idea of seeing the ocean and encountering a kind of endless abyss of danger fraught with opportunities for personal loss, for trauma that come with seeking asylum and fleeing your home through a very vast ocean. And so all of these little text moments are drawn from, as I said, articles and interviews, and they either reinforce the kind of tropes of nationalism, or they offer us a kind of another way of considering oceans as places of turmoil. And the thing about this project that I loved is that it was courageous, and there was risk, and it involved really challenging conversations around the politics of voice, and me reaffirming and kind of talking with Sam around the idea that a person can have thoughts and feelings, and they can inform work, And if we sit silent in spaces of opportunity where we can advocate for others, then we just reinforce everything that is really fucked with our world. And so it was a really great project, and yeah, I will always be really proud of working with you on that, Sam, so thank you. And yeah, that's probably enough, and we can go to Convo now.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you, all of you, for sharing, some of your backgrounds, your experiences, your processes, vulnerabilities. I think that's really important to speak to, Glenn. Like pride in what you do, but also, the support that you provide for artists, which is critical. And I really liked what you said, Glenn, too, about sharing a sense of community, which I think is not always the case in art centres, not always the case in smaller cities as well. The art world is an incredibly cruel and cynical place, as someone once said. Can be kind of cutthroat, can be quite competitive, but we do need to band together, especially in this little part of the world, to support one another in what we do, because, why else would we do that? So we're going to go through some questions. I think I have more than we have time for tonight, and I'm aware that some of you will also want to ask some questions in turn. So we'll just see what we do. We can get through. Some of them are fairly large questions, but you might also have specific questions about projects that you've heard about tonight as well. But we'll begin, I think, by thinking about Western Australian practice and the way that it's kind of framed, whether it's, inside WA or the way that it's kind of exported to the rest of Australia. And very often it's framed through ideas of a relationship to place and to landscape, and then also, I guess, by extension to ideas of the tyranny of distance and isolation from more established cultural centres. And I do use that word, in inverted commas, because it is a very, I think we only really know ourselves by defining ourselves in opposition to others. And I think, Western Australia is very much understood in relationship to eastern seaboard states as well, and maybe that's an antiquated way of thinking. Maybe that's something that we should be aiming to sort of shake up. So I was wondering, from your experience as curators, if you see this interest in landscape, in place, in isolation, in distance, as something that's an ongoing tendency in work of younger practitioners or students that you see coming up in art schools in WA.
I kind of feel like people, thinking about the knee exhibition that Yabani Kikit curated here recently, and obviously that's a First Nations, it's a Nyungar-focused exhibition about yoga and women. But I think almost the people are celebrating that distance, or our kind of, where we sit in geography, that it's become a thing to be proud of. And yeah, so, I once said to someone that we don't need people to run and jump the rabbit-proof fence to come and save us all. But yeah, I feel like the distance is a thing, but I think we're also greatly connected, and particularly with the Indian Ocean Craft Triennial, we're thinking about that distance and location and proximity rather than always looking east. Contentious, maybe.
Katherine, do you want to say?
Maybe I'm segueing, but for a long time I also haven't so much thought about this idea of the geographical separateness of WA. I think, for me, the art sector has always felt a little more connected across Australia, and or perhaps I've just been more focused on other areas of separateness within WA. I think there's a lot of work, exactly as you touched on, being done to think about cultural, social, economic distancing within practices that are happening here. So this is not moving away from the landscape. But I guess, for a long time it's not really been a focus of thinking in terms of noticing practice here always.
I guess there's the crossing the rabbit-proof fence this way, but what about the diaspora that way as well? Because, historically there's often been a tendency for practitioners to kind of complete art school here and to leave, for other shores. I left following my undergrad degree. I have a 7-month-old baby and I'm really tired. So if words are coming out in the wrong order, apologies in advance. But I, among many practitioners, was first plane, I'm out of here. And I really had that mentality of I'm never coming back. And the pandemic changed that for me for personal reasons. It also changed the world, which we can kind of discuss in more detail. But I guess, people have sought, people here have left, for education reasons, for exhibition opportunities, to be part of other arts cultures, to kind of dip their toe into some other kind of water. Do you think that this is still happening in light of what you've sort of just said about that sort of mind shift changing? And if so, by extension, what do you think we can do to cultivate and keep our talent in the state?
I think what Katherine picked up on before when she was doing her introduction, and it's a thing that we've been talking about here at Fact 2, is that through working with artists over long periods of time, at different iterations throughout their career, that we have, if a lot more of our organisations or our projects are committed to that we have more capacity to retain and develop artists over long periods of time. I think there's definitely that sort of pattern of people heading east for opportunity and for perhaps greater exposure, and some of that's probably connected to the fact that people didn't have places to be represented. They couldn't have a relationship with a gallery here that could do that bidding, and so it's hard to do that stuff over the phone and without having a relationship. But I think it has happened, but I think with more investment over longer term careers without the fear of being called nepotistic, that we can provide longer opportunity here. And I think people do go east, but similarly to you, they come back. And so it's equally about what people bring back with them at that juncture, what they're able to bring back and share, and we're a generous community, so it's not like people come back and they're just wanting, they're coming back to share their opportunity as well.
Yeah, that's true, and they don't sever their ties when they leave. They stay in contact. I think of a lot of artists who left Perth, 10 to 15 years ago, and they still, promote West Australian artists over east, and they still are like a sort of a reference point when someone goes to another city. They can be asked about opportunities or, have a social network to immediately fall into. But yeah, that pool's, during COVID, there were a few people that returned, but that pool is still there to the eastern states. Actually, 2 artists that I work with are moving to the eastern states next year. One because their partner got a job, and the other because they got into a residency program. So both pursuing particular opportunities that are over there, not for just a general lifestyle kind of change. Having said that, with the gallery, I'm not really looking. A lot of opportunities come up in the eastern states because that's sort of the way things are organised, either through government programs or the media and those sort of things. You have organisations and institutions operating within a country, but I'm sort of looking into Southeast Asia quite a bit for opportunities for the artists I work with, because going back to the distance is equivalent. And that's another thing, I think, is actually if you look at Sydney, it's a lot further away from a lot of things than Perth to some extent, depending on, if you reframe that conversation in terms of Asia. It's, So that's sort of like something that I want to look into more with the gallery, is like, we have these old trading ties with Asia that go back to pre-colonisation. So it's not like there's been a lot of exchange within the region for a long time before Australia even existed. And so that's something I think that's worth exploring and looking at as well.
And do you think, like in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is of course ongoing, there have been, perhaps some developments that have helped to mitigate that gap as well? Do you see that there are any new technologies or modes of working that have helped to kind of bridge geographical divides in any way?
I guess video art has always solved the freight problem, and technology is getting cheaper. We've had Skype for a long time. I think what COVID did is it changed the economy, and I'm speaking just from a commercial gallery perspective, but all of WA's commercial galleries sort of collapsed or closed, or people retired 10, 15 years ago, and they weren't replaced, but the market all went to galleries over east. And I feel like a lot of that business was brought home when COVID happened, and people started focusing a lot more on the local, local arts production and local practices and those sort of things. That's probably the biggest thing I noticed. But I feel like technology-wise, I feel like we're still working with the same tools, generally speaking, that we've had for a while, at least here in Perth.
I was just going to say, I guess in the wake of COVID, I and Katherine actually, I think, were still working at DARTA, the Disability and Health organisation in WA. And that was a particularly interesting time to be working there, because the common dialogue that kind of came about was, this theme of we've been looking at remote ways of working and remote ways of engaging with people for ages, and this is kind of becoming part of the natural conversation now in the midst of the pandemic, because it's affecting people that are normally platformed in these spaces. And that was, an opportunity, I think, for everyone, obviously, to kind of check themselves, but also to engage with people that do have those lived experiences of disability or lived experiences of engaging with social art practice in a different way than maybe is conventional, and not necessarily explore new technologies, but explore new ways to be integrating those technologies within common practice.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a pretty fascinating time, just in terms of disability social justice and a lot of the work that crew had been doing for a long time around access in digital spaces, and a lot of ground was covered during COVID, but again, because so many more people were asking for that technology to happen. So it was pretty interesting conversations happening. And I guess my observations of that time, also to pick up on that thread, are very much that I saw a lot more WA artists integrated into Eastern States programming, particularly in sort of live performance festival spaces, because they were shifting specifically in Melbourne and Sydney. They were shifting their programming, over 18 months to 2 years. It was quite a long form shift, and because they could commission artists without, I guess, the budget constraints of travel and freight and all those sorts of considerations, my conversations with producers particularly was that they were very much looking a lot further to present and commission work in digital spaces. So I think that was a huge shift.
Yeah, I mean, as a curator who spent I lived through the whole of Melbourne lockdown, I had a lot of time on the couch to be looking at where other people were showing, and certainly Western Australia was one of the only places where things were showing in that time. So it's a very interesting moment in history where you were cut off from the rest of the world, but the artists who were here were well supported and showing, and business was usual, whereas for the rest of us, we were living vicariously through WA in a really kind of incredible way. So I mean, I personally think that things have shifted. I think that, climate change obviously as well was already, an urgent concern, and there were artists who were internationally based who were reluctant to travel to Australia more broadly for exhibition opportunities, in addition to freight being, difficult and expensive. So there was already a kind of sense of, I guess, an environmental responsibility when you're travelling. But I think that the pandemic did open up for me new ways of working, certainly. Like I worked on a project where I was working with Jeremy Deller, who was based in London. He did a show in Melbourne. I'd moved back to Perth. So I produced that from Perth. It was shown in Melbourne. He was in London. He and I never saw it. It's just kind of, I think it did make you have to think more resourcefully and creatively, and that was by necessity anyway, even if the pandemic hadn't have happened. So
I met Annika on Zoom.
You did?
On her couch in lockdown, and proceeded to talk about how wonderful life in Western Australia was, and would like to take some credit for bringing you back to Western Australia. I was a great advocate for the state. But I think I had two very different programs across those festivals during the pandemic. The first one, heavily impacted, was Nunalungan at Pika, which I worked with Andrew on. And that was complicated. It was rescheduled, a number of times and had a couple of evolutions. And I think at that time, the thing that I found really special is the idea that people couldn't come into the state, but their ideas and their cultures and their vision and worldview could travel in a crate or on a digital drive, and so that, you know, we were one of the few places where we could still have people, even if in limited numbers, into these spaces. And then I think a year later to work on Undertow and to really shift and pivot towards working with the local. And kind of, I think at that point we all had this refreshed idea around the fact that we'd perhaps been looking too far for too long, and it was time to really celebrate WA artisan makers. And so Undertow kind of had a really good representation of WA artists and some things that could travel easily from the east as well. But I think for me, like, that idea of distance had always been a part of my practice anyway. So it was just that it was a distance you couldn't travel now. I mean, I remember when I was working with Amelia on the Ngura exhibition for the South Australian Museum, we travelled to Warrakurna, which is in our own state, via Sydney and Yulara, and it took us 19 hours. So it was a different kind of distance. It was a distance in that I couldn't share FaceTime with people. And I don't know about people in this room, but I am so over Zoom, and you know what? That could have been a phone call. So I think we've learnt a lot about what technology can offer us, but I think I've also really learnt the limitations of technology and the exhaustion and fatigue that technology can bring to practices which are really embedded in human interaction and FaceTime. So
yeah, and the incidental magic that happens from accidental and chance encounter. You know, I think when you get on a Zoom, you know exactly what you're going to say in the 40 minutes that's allotted to you, and you don't have that kind of meandering conversation, and that's often where the kind of magic, I think, happens. Shifting gears a little bit, I sort of wanted to talk about, I guess, a bit of a history of, artist-run spaces in Perth, you know, sort of outside of institutions, a bit of a kind of like DIY ethos that I think characterises the state, a certain sort of rebelliousness maybe. And so Maya, with your Cool Change hat on, and Andrew, of course, you've had lengthy experience in this area as well, can you reflect on maybe some of the unique opportunities and also maybe challenges in operating artist-run initiatives in a city like Perth?
I think kind of folding into what we just talked about in terms of the distance, you know, in West Australia there's kind of a handful of artist-run initiatives, which I think is both an opportunity and a challenge in the sense that it provides, I guess, quite a lot of remit to make work without a framework in mind, without the kind of constraints of an institution. But also at the same time, there is kind of a degree of the isolation. There's massive sprawl here. There's communities kind of across all sorts of places, and there's different kinds of funding and different kinds of respect that a creative practice has in an institutionalised setting versus in a voluntary run space. So I don't know, I guess I sort of see the opportunities and challenges as kind of twofold.
I think the one good thing about when you open an ARI here is there's a huge unmet need, so you can build an audience very quickly here. And so it kind of gives, there's an opportunity for people who don't have much experience to really get started by doing something like an ARI or something similar. I don't think it's really, it's something that, maybe this sounds weird, but you can go into it with a lot of naivety or something, and or like with a lot of energy, and it's something that you can build quite quickly here. I feel like even in terms of opening a commercial gallery here, I feel like if I opened it in other states, I would have struggled a lot more to find an audience. I feel like there's really like just an uncatered need here. And it's an experience I've had with previous galleries as well, such as OK, and I know Cool Change as well had some very big openings right from the beginning. So like I would encourage people to give it a go if you have the energy and the time. But one thing I would say as well is I think a lot of people, and sometimes I think like this as well, think of ARIs as sort of institutions in the making, so you're working towards making something permanent. There's been so many fantastic ARIs that have opened in Perth that lasted a year or lasted 2 exhibitions or whatever. So, and I feel like whenever something closes, it provides an opportunity for something else to open. And you don't need a great space as well. So many good shows I've seen in garages, like so many great shows I've seen in garages or in people's homes. Yeah, I feel like I've meandered from the original question.
Not at all. I mean, I think that you've described a thirst. You know, there's a thirst for culture here, and there is a kind of ready-made audience, at least in a kind of well-versed art-going public. But what about broader audiences? You know, how do we cultivate broader audiences for the arts in Western Australia? And so by extension, how do we foster new generations of art supporters and philanthropists? Because I think increasingly as we think about funding and the necessity for new models of funding, we need to think about how we generate, you know, younger generations of supporters for the arts. And so how do we get them off the beach and into the galleries?
I think a lot of that comes back to the responsibility and obligation that we have in spending public money. And I think that's one thing that I'm really mindful of in these spaces, is that I'm not here to curate exhibitions and to write labels that are written for my friends. I'm here to create pathways to art for a broader community. And so I think that's a huge curatorial responsibility. I think our job is to service the public and our stakeholders, and of course that is to accommodate our peers and our colleagues and the artistic community that we're working with. But if we are funded through public dollars, then I think we need to ensure that we have access pathways for people of differing abilities, people of differing educations, people that speak English as a second, third, fourth language, and to ensure that the material that we generate and the collateral that is paired with exhibitions and programming is accessible. Because if you can write a label that has someone have a response that's never really set foot in an art gallery, that encourages them to come back and to, you know, as teenagers come back and as adults to come back and become champions for a space, who then go on to make lots of money and become donors to these spaces. Like, I think if we start with access for everyone, then you can create change in a generation, rather than just creating like a donors circle and having that pop up and happen quickly, right?
I mean, Katherine, how does that translate to your experience of working in the public realm as well? I mean, I think things like Mumbukai had, you know, enormous number of visitors from a huge, broad audience.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
And is the audience something that you're actively thinking about in that way? You spoke about accessibility earlier, but are you thinking about the audience as much as artists when you're creating work in a site responsive way?
Absolutely. I mean, my response to that initial question would be, you know, you take the work to the beach, which is sort of what we've been thinking about. No, absolutely. You know, the reason I sort of moved into this sort of festival making is there was opportunities to think about working with places that people are already connected to. And in WA, it is specifically around the ocean and the river. You know, water bodies here just bring people together, probably like nowhere else in Australia. I don't want to speak for the whole of Australia, but, you know, my experience of being here. And so this idea of bringing arts practice to work with these places and inviting artists to be in these places with audience is something that we think about a lot. And then by extension, you know, I think there's that question of donors is always such an interesting one here, because, you know, those moments at the ocean together experiencing work, exactly as you said, that grows through generations. If we can, you know, reach people outdoors, perhaps then those people who have never stepped into a gallery will come here, and there's a lot of work to be done here around not so much embedding culture, it's sort of here, but like making people realising that that's really what they're seeing is arts and culture. You know, there's always that conversation here that seems to just never quite stick, and then that sort of building of understanding of sort of how public funding works, so people can kind of, there's just a lot of misunderstanding, I think, around the support that the sector needs, and there's also donor culture here is really an odd space. I think it has a lot of ground to cover, and I am in no means an expert. But then I think on the flip side of that, there's something institutions can do to there's something around resourcing in this space. I 10 years ago, I went to a creative partnerships workshop that I was like, I'm going to fundraise and build, the donor circles and blah, blah, blah. And I just remember the statistic on, and it might have changed, it was something like, imagine 40% of whatever labour or sort of say 100% of what you get from a donor, 40% of that has already gone out in your labour and the resources needed to get that 10 grand. And I think we all go into donor things being like, I'm going to get 100 grand. It's like, no, you're going to do 40 grand of work to get that 100 grand most of the time. And so I think there's a resourcing in the sector itself that's not there that is needed to be able to grow that kind of donor philanthropic spaces that I, having a single staff member who works on that is not quite enough, Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to jump to a question that we were asked by the audience, which is relating to education, because I also think education is absolutely critical in fostering new audiences for the arts. It's something that, if you can get kids in and out of your gallery spaces at a young age, then they hopefully become the people that are return supporters over the course of their life, but it also makes being an artist a viable career as well, if kids see this and realise that that's a pathway. And so how do you see arts education, particularly in its current state in Western Australia, as potentially influencing future trends for art in WA?
Well, I think the obvious one is that with current pricing structures for education in the arts outside of STEM, it requires somebody to have a level of privilege to be able to perhaps afford that education or to be indentured to a HEX program for a very long time. So I think we're probably only going to start understanding the impact of those shifts to education in the next 3, 4, 5 years. And I think we'll start to see kind of changes. I mean, like in terms of university provisions for First Nations artists, we lost those courses a long time ago, and so people were forced to go into TAFE or other learning possibilities, and that had a huge impact. So we had a groundswell of Noongar practitioners who are now senior and very established professional artists who are at the top of their game, but there is an apparent gap between the next generation of people and those more senior people, meaning that the strain on both the senior and established artists is felt a lot more, and they are overworked practitioners whose names repeat over and over in every space. And then you now have a generation of younger arts workers, curators and artists who are equally the hot thing and who are experiencing fatigue at much earlier rates of their careers. So the potential harm done to that in the First Nations space has been very apparent for quite some time. And I think that will probably be mirrored kind of in the broader community, artistic community over the next few years. Well, that's uplifting, isn't it?
Any other thoughts on state of arts education in WA?
I mean, do you mean sort of more university context?
Yeah,
or
exactly.
You don't mind?
I mean, that was a question that's how it was worded. But I mean, universities are in crisis across Australia. I think that's probably particularly pronounced here.
Yeah.
It's around like teaching staff, opportunity available, courses, other.
It's just, I mean, it's so hard to say because it's just so bad at the moment, isn't it? It's just like horrific. I don't know if I have anything more to comment in that space, but an interesting shift that I've sort of noticed thinking about more in sort of secondary school spaces is there seems to be a bigger conversation happening about, rather than just inviting, students to come in to, say, experience this gallery show or a festival event, is this idea of sort of school incursions. It's not new, but a lot more programming, which is like centering students as creators who can then contribute to institutions, to festivals, in terms of making a thing that's then presented. And I think there's something in a building of a generation who see themselves already as creators very early on that then hopefully transitions to more people filing through universities, perhaps, this is very, hopeful and idyllic, but this kind of idea of...
There's always TikTok as well.
Absolutely.
People
Film content on
learning via
TikTok is huge, yeah. But there is something also, I don't know enough about university stats, to be honest, but there must be something in terms of like a demand for certain courses and the kind of building up on that. But we're getting into tricky political territory here.
No.
I mean, where do those kids go from John Curtin, the specialist kids that come in and develop this kind of rigour and confidence around their practices as young people, to then find themselves at this juncture where they have to make a choice between a life of debt to do further education or making a very rapid, nimble pivot?
So in light of this kind of not overly rosy picture for younger people, and some of the challenges that we've also talked about, what do you do next when you've made a decision that you're living and working here and you've been through the handful of institutions that there are here. Andrew, I think you're incredibly inspiring in the way that you've gone out on your own, and maybe alternative models is sort of the answer, not relying on existing institutions but starting your own thing, and I think educationally that's a potential as well. But I guess in light of all that, what advice might you have for budding artists, curators, arts professionals who are kind of coming up in Perth and who might want to remain here? How can they go about establishing a career in the arts in Perth without leaving?
Yeah, I wish someone had told me that 15 years ago. I mean, I still don't really know. There's not a linear career trajectory like there are in other industries. Instead of it being like a ladder you climb, it's very up and down. So, I've moved between senior roles and then back into junior roles and those sort of things. So I guess it's just managing those sort of expectations and just being prepared to be flexible, I suppose, which are very easy things to say. But that's just my experience, yeah.
I think as well, like on a maybe more practical level, like definitely agree that, the career trajectory, if you can call it kind of a career trajectory, is definitely, non-linear. But I guess ways that I've kind of found support have been through initiatives that kind of are self-sufficient. So, volunteering, finding ways that you can sort of seek mentorship with peers or with, people in these spaces that you respect. I think it does take endurance, but yeah, I think that's like an understatement. But yeah, I think there's kind of that hope in the sense that you can kind of align with people that you feel I guess are exploring things that you're interested in, and we do have a close community in some ways, and that has an odd way of kind of working itself out too.
Well, good. Thank you for ending on a positive note there. And before we are going to go to the audience for questions, but I also, before we do, wanted to kind of also talk about, a more positive sort of ending to this conversation and celebrating some of the kind of dynamic projects that we've seen in Perth over the last couple of years. So you might have noticed behind us on this slide, there's kind of a carousel of images that have been on rotation, and these are sort of images of projects that our panel tonight have sort of selected as some of the kind of, I guess, highlights, whether they're visual arts or multi-arts experiences that they've seen here over the last couple of years. So I don't want to, throw anyone under the spot, but was there any projects that you'd like to reflect on that sort of celebrate our sense of place and the strength and diversity of practice that's coming up here?
I want to get in before KW. I think one of the most profound things that I've experienced in the last few years was Witness Stand. I think and KW worked on that as well, so congratulations. But it was such a simple kind of proposition. Sit with country for a moment, listen to a story, watch the world go by. They're all things which are so inherent in a kind of, some weird understanding of what it is to live in Australia, right? Like, these are the things that we grow up hearing about, taking a moment to watch the world go by and the stories of place. And for me, I went to 2 of them. I booked tickets for all of them, but it was a crazy time. And like, both of them changed my life, because not only did they celebrate stories of place that have been held in custodianship with my ancestors for such a long time, but they also kind of, they just transformed you. Like, they were opportunities to enter in as one human and enter out as another. And for me, I think that was about sharing that experience with a whole lot of people from all walks of life, many of whom had no idea what they were getting in for, and to kind of have custodians. And I think that custodianship, like, we talk about that word all the time, but Witness Stand elevated custodianship to a different level. It was people talking on behalf of country for us to hear and share in that moment. And the idea of placing them at different locations around the river systems was just really, really beautiful. And during a busy time at festival time, which we all know is intense and never ending, and it feels like an endurance race to get to the end of it, while we're all running around trying to see each other's work as well, it was a moment to sit and reflect and just be still. Yeah, so thanks, Katherine, for working on that. It was incredible.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. That work completely changed my life working on it. And I think there's a simplicity in that work, which was simply an invitation to gather and sit and listen. And that invitation was sent to the artists who made the work and also to the audiences. And so there's just something really beautiful, I think, about sitting the place at moments of change, so at sunrise, at sunset, and just holding that also when you're making work as well is sometimes the sort of the simplest moments are actually the most powerful. And that question, I'm going to say, maybe it's a bit of a rogue example, but like the question that came through today was like, what was really moving for you? And there's sort of several works, and sitting with Witness Stand across every single one of the something like 123 performances was very much that. But the other one that just really stays in my mind, and I feel like this happens a lot where like the music scene of WA is not really like brought into these contemporary art conversations. And for me, one of the most beautiful moments was like the Porch Fest on Harbour Road after the lockdown, which for those of you who don't know is literally a community-run, tiny music festival on a street where people just let musicians have their porches. There's a bit of a program, there's a couple of posters stuck up to say that it's happening, and I think at the beginning, now they actually get permission, but I think at the beginning they just did it and didn't worry about getting permission or closing the road or la. And just this idea of, a significant period of time of everyone being trapped in their homes, this sort of opening of a home and inviting musicians to be on your sort of front porch with, hundreds of people standing in a street just listening to music was just a really beautiful moment. I also picked this one. I just sent Emma a bunch. Like I was like, I can't pick one. That makes me panic. But someone else would like to say something. Please go for it.
I picked this one. No, knee.
Oh, you picked that one?
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
I feel like that show was very visceral, and moving in that way, in the sense that it had rage, it had hurt, it had this vulnerability and this yearning at the same time that was very felt in the room and very powerful. And yeah, just I guess a real gem in my mind in terms of truth telling and seeing artistic excellence from Yorgas.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed watching Curtis's practice over the last several years. Working with him on the show at Pika was probably a bit of a highlight for me. There was definitely like a very different approach to using an institutional space, but using it to his advantage. It was a very clever and considered show, and then working with him at Sweet Pea now and just seeing the continuation of that work has just been really yeah, that's just been a really good experience for me. I like seeing how people's practices travel over the long term, so I've enjoyed watching that. You know, like before he made mostly films, and then he's gone into more object work, and also seeing how he's dealing with his work thematically as well. Yeah, that's probably been a highlight for me. But also just like many of my artists, I have that experience with as well. Yeah.
Thank you all. That's kind of a nice. Oh, there's one more. Whose is that? Oh, you.
So this is Jilla Kudra, which is a collaboration between Curtis's father, so Desmond Taylor, and Marianne Pugh, a Perth-based fibre textiles artist. And this was a project that kind of had existed in some form in our program before my arrival, and I had the great privilege of sort of working with it in its delivery stages and working with the artists. And I think the thing for me about this was the actual essentialist kind of collaboration that was really there. It was really open, and the artists had pushed this project along like in the background for a long time, and manifested these beautiful rugs which spoke to this Jilla Kudra story, the two men dreaming. So and yeah, like from an exhibition making point of view, trying to create a round or a circle in that space was a challenge, and we had a little moment of success, which was quite nice. So yeah, I mean, as curators, we look at those funny things, yeah.
Can I say one more?
Please.
Just because it needs to be said. Seven Sisters, like WA Museum, or no, National Museum. If you didn't see that show, everyone, find the book, read it. It was, for me, one of the most life-changing, you know, exhibitions that I've seen come from, I mean, I'm not going to say this state because it sort of goes beyond, yeah.
And the John O'Comfort show at John Curtin Gallery was also quite incredible. No picture of it, but Google.
We could go on, but obviously art today in WA is alive and thriving and kicking. Has anyone in the audience got any questions that they would like to ask any of the panellists, or, you know, raise for collective discussion?
Oh, got that. Someone always has to break that. So one thing I've been sort of thinking about, and one of the, I guess, challenges coming out of university I found was you were very encouraged to go into free labour. I'm very against that. I think I'm interested in how maybe as a community we can shore up. I know in the graphic design industry they've started a new initiative where sort of experts from the industry are actually going to different types of universities and saying, do not engage in a free internship. This is what you should be asking for. These are the rates, these are the protections. If you're working on a build project, you need to be paid at X amount of rate. And maybe about, I guess, interest in where our state institution like AGWA or different areas are asking for free labour, and also what that does to representation of middle and lower class artists. Because only, you know, if you can give up 2 or 3 days a week to volunteer for 2 years to maybe get a job in the institution, you're maybe of a certain wealth class. That means we're sort of safeguarding, or, you know, again, that one view is being protected. So I think like the Biennale is obviously doing great things to challenge that, and FAC are working towards that, but maybe as a community, like what the discussion could be around that to maybe shore up, or if that's just my opinion as well, and that's not seen as an issue. But
I think it starts with us knowing our value, right? Like if we, and I know that's a big blanket statement, but when we say yes to free labour, we allow kind of power to play out in our lives for potential opportunity. I mean, the first thing that I did when I got here was really evaluate our fee structure and what artists get paid, and, you know, what commissions look like from our point of view, and like that, while that might sound like a kind of business-like way to think about creativity, like we must remember that art is also at its foundation a business, and that wealth is made in this business, and that collections are repositories of wealth. And so the idea that somehow this is a kind of classless structure is a farce. And so I think it's being really honest and aware of those different structures. Like we're talking about donors at one point. So we're talking about wealth as being an opportunity and a place where we draw from to enable creativity. And then we're also talking about poverty and the places that artists often exist in, and we hear tropes like, great art comes out of adversity, and we have an art history, or at least a European and white art history, which affirms that. And we have structures around the world like America is known for its internships. Like, all curators do years of internships before they're even looked at. So I think it's like being really honest about those structures and knowing that I might not be able to affect change at MoMA with Glenn Lowry, but I can affect change here, and I can encourage my peers and artists in the community to really evaluate what an opportunity is. If it ain't paying you, if it ain't buying your time, then you shouldn't be doing it. And I think it's challenging power through questioning that stuff and then going, no, I'm not gonna do that, which is hard to do. But are you better maybe being a little poorer and having more time to be truly creative, and finding other ways to generate income which don't rely on power structures which are connected to patriarchy and the arts is not void of kind of all of this shit.
I'm sort of going to generalise a little bit here, but it sort of drives me nuts. This is particularly true of, I think we've spoken about this, in the visual arts space. There seems to be a real underpaying, like artists undervaluing and underpaying themselves comparative to, things like dance sector, contemporary dance, performance, all the sort of more artistic roles perhaps that sit more under the sort of live performance award rates. I found this moving from sort of visual art spaces to festival spaces. I was just like blown away. I was like, what is going on? We've just been underpaying ourselves for fucking this is nuts. And so I think there's something that all artists can do in terms of just understanding what their peers are sort of getting paid, what the sort of award rates are in other sectors, how do you, what's the sort of level you're sitting at, how do you sort of see yourself in terms of that? And I think there's a lot of work that I think that has to be institutionally led in all majority of cases, and there is slow moves happening. But yeah, it's...
there's that joke that the one time we pay ourselves NAVA rates is when we get a grant, and that's like another thing that you hear all the time, and it's kind of true. Like, we go and do these budgets for funding bodies, and they're all NAVA, and then it's like there's like the hidden layers in the Excel sheet, which is like what we'll actually do. And I think it's about kind of trying to lift our rates to be NAVA all the time, right? And not having... And it's hard because we have such a great community of generous people who always want to help each other out and make things happen and make magic happen. But it's like learning how we can turn that generosity into transactions that support greater economy.
And I think COVID taught us something about the idea of like a salary, like a wage, how good that is, and
good.
So good. And there's like slow movements. Like I think of per festival in terms of the artist associate roles they have, like actually employing artists. And there's something in thinking about that institutions and artists in terms of approaches is just. If that's something that, going, what works for me financially? Do I work better this way or this way? And sort of seeking out opportunities perhaps that might offer that. It's definitely... Oh, sorry, Dan.
I was going to say, do you think that, I guess, part of the values that, dance, music and theatre is often trajectories? So there's like an inherent value where you're making money to begin with, whereas in, Australia especially, art's often free, and when you go to, Europe, the values are often private and paycheck,
Totally, yeah. But that is shifting. I think there's a lot more, even in festival programming now, there's free dance. They're trying to, a part of their sort of audience engagement strategies is offering different things free, rather than it used to just be the visual arts program was the only free thing. And now they're sort of really breaking down those sort of barriers between things. So I think there's a conversation that can happen because that's shifting. Hopefully this can shift.
Interestingly, Annika and I are talking about a project for 2024, and we talked about ticketing recently, and it's actually ticketing elevates our work. It says that this is not something that should be expected to be a free thing. And because in every time we say arts for everyone and make it free, it's always the visual arts that does that first, and that creates really difficult tensions, particularly in the festival space. Like trying to get promotion when you're competing against events that rely on seats to sell is really challenging, and you can understand why, but it doesn't make it any easier to kind of experience. So.
I was just going to reiterate Catherine's point about working in isolation as opposed to in theatre and dance. Like a lot of artists work in isolation, and I know in theatre everyone has their roles, but they also work together, and so these things are discussed as a group often, whereas in the arts you don't really discuss it with anyone. So yeah, I've come across some really terrible old contracts of some artists I've worked with where it's not just working for free but paying for opening costs, including catering and drinks and all these sort of things. I've seen situations where an artist sold half their work and still owed the gallery money. Like, there's some really bad situations. So there are resources out there like NAVA and Arts Law and all these sort of things, but I do think there needs to be some way to ask, I guess, developing informal channels where you can ask for advice, some people that you can speak to about contracts and what's fair for different situations is pretty valuable, particularly when you're first getting out of uni. Aside from that, I would join an association like NAVA, and I don't know, people talk about unionising as well. I don't know whether that's a viable avenue, but I also think in terms of arts install, if people who are arts installer, because that's often a complement to arts practice, is I feel like that role should also be formalised a bit more in the same way that other trades are. Like it should actually be documented, and in that way it can be more of a case for it being a specialist trade, which it is. But that's another discussion, which is a bit of moves away from your question. Yeah.
On that note, actually, that you finished off in terms of, arts installers' work kind of being a bit more specialised. Like, I mean, this might be showing, my age, I guess, in a way, but at least the experience I had when I was at uni was that you studied art, and what came out of that was being an artist or an art teacher. And I now, I guess, work on the other side of that, more in sort of arts management and curatorial practice. And I wish that I had learnt a little bit more about that sort of business side of things when I was studying art, and that kind of lack of the formalisation in terms of knowing what kinds of tangible employed prospects exist also meant that it was very difficult for me to advocate for what or what my labour was worth initially. So yeah, I guess kind of as a tangent to what you're saying, arts installing is one facet of what a career in the visual arts sector can look like, but I think there's still a variety that aren't really being addressed and formalised in that way.
Professionalising your practice is certainly something that I hear a lot of students universally kind of complain about when they're sort of spat out into the world after graduating. Even basic things like, what do I put on my website? How do I document my images? There's so many kind of questions, and I think, talking to your peers is the best thing you can do to kind of work out what the landscape is around you. Are there other questions for the panel at all?
There's been a couple of Instagram accounts that have... there's been a fair bit of debate about what critique is, right? And a couple of Instagram accounts which were warring with each other here in Perth, which made for entertaining and quite insightful viewing at times. And look, I think we need more criticism. Like, we need more rigorous discussion around what makes good practice, and what makes kind of work that is truly meaningful to us in the here and now. And I think there's a big problem with arts journalism at the moment. It's really hard to get coverage. It's really hard to get something written which is courageous and seeks to unpick the work that we do as curators and creative contributors. But I think it's really vital, and I think that's the way that artists get a real sense of what the sector and what the broader industry is feeling. But I also think there's a role for more broader community critique, inviting conversation from our broader community, from people who aren't the art educated part of our sector, to give us feedback as to what our exhibitions offer, what our art offers, what it does from an educational point of view, from a cultural point of view. And I think, there's a big gap. But there are great organisations, like we're doing some work, hopefully in the next year, with Seesaw to look at what the role can be for First Nations community. One of the big challenges in the First Nations space around critique is our web of interconnectivity, and the fact that if I, for example, Yabani Kickett makes a work that I think is not particularly interesting, which has not happened today and will never happen. This is a hypothetical. But, Yabani and I are connected culturally and through familial connection. We've worked together. And so there's a fear of being seen to cut your own mob down through having critical, rigorous dialogue around art. And also that art is not a gratuitous thing in the worldview of First Nations people. It is an expression of our cultural selfhood. It is deeply connected to our ancestral lineage. And so it's a hard thing to have really rigorous art historic critical frameworks applied to in that First Nations space. But more broadly, I think more of us as producers and curators should be more active in the space of reviewing our peers. Because in WA there's a generosity and which could perhaps feed into a culture of us not having that dialogue, but it's also around the resourcing of our roles to be able to step into that space and to have the support of our organisations to be making critical commentary in the sector, which is not always given. So there you go.
Any other questions? No. Well, in that case, we might call it an evening. I have no idea what the time is. I hope we're... 8:09. Okay, great. It was feeling like it was drawing to a natural end. But yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you, panel, for sharing your wisdom and ideas. Thank you, Glenn, for hosting us all here this evening. Pleasure. And yeah, if anyone has any informal questions as well, feel free to approach us afterwards, or you know where we live and work, and that's something that I always say to not live, you know where we are in general. But something I always say to artists is that just sing out for a coffee. We're not like these people that are behind kind of bricks and mortar that are impenetrable and inaccessible. And so if you do have questions or need support or want to show your work, I'm always welcome, always up for a studio visit, always up for a coffee, and that probably extends to all of you as well. So reach out. But thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone.